Today on Perspectiva, the US Supreme Court curbs President Trump's birthright citizenship plan while expanding presidential powers. But is this a setback for Trump or a bigger victory in disguise? And Iran declares the Strait of Hormuz a strategic opportunity, but could its ambitions reshape global energy supply? Hello and welcome to Perspectiva. I'm Tom Philpot. Now, the United States Supreme Court has delivered a mixed set of rulings for President Donald Trump, rejecting some of his most ambitious policies while also expanding presidential powers in several key areas. Now, in a major setback, the court ruled against Trump's attempt to end birthright citizenship for children born in the United States to temporary visitors and undocumented immigrants. Now, Trump called the decision too bad for our country, but expressed support for legislation that could revive his proposal. However, such a bill faces significant political and constitutional hurdles. The birthright citizenship ruling marks one of several recent defeats for the president. Earlier this year, the Supreme Court also struck down Trump's efforts to impose broad new tariffs on America's trading partners. In another case, the court blocked his attempt to deploy National Guard troops to Chicago for immigration, enforcement and crime control without the state approval. But despite these losses, the court's conservative majority has continued to strengthen presidential authority in several important areas. On Monday, the justices ruled that the president has greater authority to remove leaders of independent federal regulatory agencies, giving the White House increased influence over labor, environmental communications and financial policy. Well, the court has also backed Trump's immigration agenda by allowing the administration to revoke temporary protected status for certain immigrant groups and by tightening rules for asylum seekers. Now, in election-related decisions, the court eased campaign finance restrictions, a ruling expected to benefit Republicans ahead of the upcoming midterm elections. It also issued decisions affecting congressional district boundaries, potentially reshaping the political landscape in several states. Now, the legal experts say the current Supreme Court has adopted one of the broadest views of presidential power in modern American history. And with speculation growing that another conservative justice could soon retire, President Trump may have yet another opportunity to further shape the nation's highest court. But to discuss this, we're joined by our guest, Anna Maria Evans, who is a geopolitical analyst. Hello and welcome back to Perspectiva. So the Supreme Court has rejected President Trump's attempt to end birthright citizenship. How significant is this ruling from a constitutional perspective?
Well, this is a really important ruling because it shows us the limits of the executive power versus the constitutional power and, the legislative powers of the state. So a first pillar of its importance is how the powers are limited within the US and there is no way that President Trump can rule over these other powers. On the other hand, it is also a very important landmark with regard to the great discussions around immigration. As we know, immigration has become a challenge worldwide. It's not just in the US, in Europe as well, with the emergence of nationalist and populist parties. So the topic of immigration is a very, very big challenge politically. And this decision has also addressed that challenge. And how so? The decision of the court has made it clear that what in legal terms we call jus soli, meaning the right to be a citizen because of being born on the soil of a given country, that prevails. And so there can be no executive order that will change a rule, this jus soli rule, that has stand, for many decades. So these are really important landmarks, both in terms of institutional power balances and in terms of how the country is its citizens and the rights and duties and the identity that are entangled with citizenship.
Anna, despite this setback, the court has expanded presidential powers in other cases. How should we interpret this mixed approach by the Supreme Court?
Well, it looks like for the Supreme Court, there are very clear divisions on what can be, strengthened in terms of executive power versus what cannot be. And so we could say that with regard to defense decisions, for example, or decisions on the bureaucracy, on the administrative apparatus, the institutional apparatus that sustains the state, as well as defense, these are areas where it is notorious that President Trump has managed to keep, a strong executive arm. However, in other areas, for example, the citizen rights, which is the case that we are now discussing, but previously to that, issues of tariffs and therefore commerce, which is so important for the economy, then, the Supreme Court has not allowed so much leverage to the executive, meaning in the hands of the president. So we see that there are different subjects that are treated differently by the Supreme Court. And again, we are talking about balance of power between institutions. So it looks like the administrative apparatus has lost power in this new constitutional framework, but the economic issues and the identity, individuality, rights and issues related to immigration, those have remained as they were previously, meaning with separation of powers and limits on executive presidential authority.
And Anna, the court also struck down Trump's proposed tariffs. What does this decision mean for US trade policy and the economy?
So, as we know, the tariffs can matter and very much on inflation, on prices. And so whatever the decision is with regard to, up and, to raising or reducing or limiting powers on deciding on tariffs, that inevitably has relation to what will happen with prices, product prices. Furthermore, we know we are at war, energy war, logistics war, because of the Middle East situation, the Hormuz Strait, and also the Russian situation. And when we have an energy war, the prices are already bubbling because transportation prices, insurances, the number of days that the ship see, all these matters for the prices. And so at this stage, any minor tariff decision impacts even further because it adds to the geopolitical situation that we are currently dealing with. However, a last note on this specific topic, one must always have in mind that exchange currencies also matter for prices. So it's not just the tariffs, it's also exchange currencies, and that needs to be taken into account in terms of calculations of how much inflation we hope to have next within the country.
So how might the rulings on immigration, including temporary protected status and asylum restrictions, affect immigrants and US border policy?
Look, the immigration issue is an issue that has been going on for decades. And so we need to be historical when contextualizing this issue. And unfortunately, often people tend to forget that the challenge of immigration in the US is not only a challenge for President Trump. So, for example, President Obama deported more immigrants than President Trump did during his mandate when we compare the numbers. And so this is not just a Republican or a personal issue. It is historically a problem with which the United States has dealt with, not only because of immigrants that came from the Mexican border and from Mexico itself, but also because of migrants that come from Central America. And so what we expect here is that after the Supreme Court decision that prevents the derogation of the jus soli norm, meaning the norm where someone who is born in the US is entitled to citizenship, being born in the US territory. So since the Supreme Court upheld this norm, which has been long-lasting in the legal and jurisprudential tradition of the US, what we can expect is to have more supervision, more vigilance, and more controls at the border and, in other levels of immigration situations. So, but these kinds of controls, I must insist, historically have been held. So the mechanisms of deportation are not something new in the US. They come, from the last decades. So, but what we can expect is that the numbers now will rise. And so in this second mandate by President Trump, it might, happen that the numbers equal or surpass what happened, for example, with President Obama. But the numbers we have so far are not very clear because there are different ways to measure. So let's see what will happen next in terms of, acting on borders, acting on chasing illegal migrants or migrants with a criminal record.
Well, the Supreme Court has relaxed campaign finance restrictions. And what effect could this have on the upcoming US midterm elections?
Time that financial restrictions are laxed with regard to donations to political parties, what we expect is two basic things to happen. One is that elections are expensive. We will see donors, giving out more money, and we will see the super PACs, organizations gaining leverage, and the central apparatus of the parties will need to be more compliant and articulative with these financial structures that donate. So anytime there is a relaxation in party giving, there is some impact within the institutional leverage of a given party or of the two parties. So the central structures of the parties will need, to give a say to those who pay. So as the old say, says, the one who pays for the pipe calls the tune. So that's what basically this means.
Well, some legal experts say the court now holds one of the broadest views of presidential authority in US history. Do you agree? Why or why not?
Well, it depends on the field of policy making. So in defense, as has happened in the past, the president has held quite some leverage in commanding what is happening, for example, in the Middle East, in the Strait of Hormuz. And, the American intervention with regard to Iran, there we see that the president is acting as the commander-in-chief with a lot of executive leverage. But it's not all the same in different policy areas. So, for example, in terms of the public administration of the US, the president has also shown a lot of authority to decrease and shrink the public administration, to terminate programs, to terminate, human resources, and that has had a lot of impact in terms of the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. But these are two specific areas, policy areas. The institutional area of the state, the institutional pillars of the administration is one area, defense is another area where the president actually holds or has held a lot of executive power. But in other areas, it's not like that. So in other areas, the Supreme Court, like in this case of the immigration, the Supreme Court has made it very clear that the president cannot overrule a norm on use solely on the right to citizenship being based on being born on the soil of American territory. So the president cannot overrule this right with executive powers, and the Supreme Court has made that very clear. In the areas of tariffs and commercial policy, we also have seen, that there is a clear limitation of how much the president really wanted to exert central authority. And we need to have in mind that, President Trump's appointed judge have indeed actually voted against his own will, and so on a more conservative institutional maintenance of the status quo. So it can't just be said over generally that the president now has a lot of power because the Supreme Court agrees with that. That's an overgeneralization, and it really varies according to specific decision-making area.
Well, looking ahead, if another Conservative justice retires and President Trump appoints a replacement, how could that influence the direction of the Supreme Court and American politics in the years to come?
Well, it is really not very easy to predict how much impact that would have, precisely because of what I have just said. We have seen that even, a conservative President Trump appointed judge has voted against the president's will on policy areas that are regarded by the Supreme Court in its majority as areas where the president cannot overrule, norms that have been congressionally approved. So it really depends on the policy area. I think this is where analysts must be very careful, because we cannot overgeneralize. It is expected that in some areas, a majority conservative Supreme Court might, lend a stronger executive hand to the president, but not in all areas. It depends on how the subject matter really impacts, the very basic notions and freedoms of the US as they were conceived by the founders. This historical weight is really important and will prevail. So we can't, just overgeneralize and say, oh, the president will do whatever he wants. No, he won't do whatever he wants. There are limits.
Anna, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.